Excellent. Hey, Chief.
Hey, Cyrus, what are we talking about today?
So today we're going to talk about how to make a comic book.
Okay, let's do that.
Excellent. So you've been making comic books for a few decades now, right?
Almost 25 years, a little over that.
Right. So you've had a lot of different parts in the process, but I think it's definitely important for our viewers to understand all that goes into making one. So let's first talk about the different steps.
Yeah. Well, I think when you create a comic book, you always have to figure out who your audience is first.
Sure.
That's generally what I consider these days. It took me a long time to get to that point because it used to be about, what is it that interests me? What is a good idea that I have that I want to do? But throughout the years, I've realized when we're creating a comic book, it's an entertainment property.
Right.
So you want to entertain people more than entertain yourself.
Sure.
So I, at some point, my mindset switched from wanting to create something for myself to say, who are we creating this for?
Yeah,
who is our target audience?
So I guess really what you're talking about there is making things for a commercial purpose rather than something that's, for more purely for yourself, right?
Yeah, I think when you create something for yourself, you sometimes lose sight of what you're trying to do.
Sure.
Comic book is a business. A lot of people don't realize that because somebody's pulling money out of the wallet to make to pay for it, and
Makes
you
sense.
want to make sure they get their money's worth.
Right. Exactly.
That's really a key thing. A lot of creators don't realize.
Right. So all of these different parts, as long as they're done well, I assume will really help make sure that the final product is important. So I think the most important and the first step is, of course, the pre-production and planning stage.
Yes,
where
there's
you're
a lot
really
of that.
just trying to better understand how the comic comes together, and really understand the characters, the setting, all of that.
Sure.
What are the things that you focus on most when you're in the pre-production stage?
Pre-production is always, like I said, identify an audience. What audience group am I trying to capture? Am I trying to get the American comic book crowd, or am I trying to go for the anime manga crowd?
Right, makes sense.
Yeah, when you identify that, then you have to say, okay, what are some of the popular genres in these type of different comic books?
Sure.
And within these genres, who are the demographic? A lot of times people don't consider that. Who do you have more male audience or female audience for this particular genre and type of story that you tell?
Sure. So let's give an example then. Superhero comics have a very specific demographic.
Yes.
And the different type of heroes that you tell, or the different kind of story you tell, really does match with a certain age group. Like just Marvel comics in general. Those tend to run for an older crowd than DC comics did back in the day. So making that assumption is a really important part to being able to help plan the comic, I assume, right?
Well, superhero comic tend to skew more to our male audiences.
Sure.
When I was at Marvel, I think our ratio was like 90%, 95% male and 5 to 10% female.
Oh wow.
Yeah. But then when I was doing work for Tokyo Pop, they were telling me a lot of their books is 50-50.
Sure.
Yeah. So you really have to keep that in mind when you're developing a comic book, a story or an idea.
Yeah, that makes sense. Considering the fact that comics are a very visual art form, I'd say the next most important thing would be the art, obviously,
Yes.
right?
Art is, if you can control it yourself, like myself, who can also draw my own books, that's fine. I can determine a look. I can even fine-tune it. But when you're working with an artist, someone who's not yourself, who's just trying to implement your idea, that's where you have to really put into consideration of, what kind of art style fits what the kind of story I want to tell.
Sure, makes sense. Along with that, then, you also have to take into account your budget.
Yes.
With some of your earlier books that you've done, you've really had to make sure that the artists fit your vision, but also could be able to do the work in a timely fashion with the pay that you're able to give, right?
Yes. With something like Captain China, which developed that as a 12-issue story arc.
Right.
At the time, didn't realize how much work and money is involved to execute a project that long.
Sure.
So that was one of the problems that I encountered very early on. Almost immediately after the beginning, I realized, this is a lot more labor intensive, and it becomes a lot more costly because you got to pay your artist 12 times instead of once.
Makes sense.
Which is why last time when we talked about Scarlet Scar, then I say, okay, let's implement something that is much smaller,
in scope. Yeah.
in scope, and then do just a self-contained 25-page comic book, so you can just kind of get it done very quickly.
Makes sense.
So that's also something you want to keep in mind if you're creating your own comic book. Do I want to go for a long serial do I have the enough money to keep a long serial going, or am I going to draw it myself? And will I be interested in drawing a book for that long?
Yeah.
So that's something a lot of times creators have to ask themselves. Or do I want to try smaller projects, one shots, 20, 30, 40 pages, and be done with that project and say, okay, how do I like the process? Do I want to continue? Do I want to pay somebody to continue? Or do myself have an interest and says, I want to do some more?
Sure. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
There's a lot of planning that can go into that,
Yes.
definitely. When you were going through the bidding process, what was that like when you're trying to find an artist?
Finding an artist for Captain China was somewhat difficult because I had a few criteria.
Right.
Because at the time I thought, not that I had any particular style in mind, but when I was looking for it, I wanted to say, okay, let's cater a little bit more toward Asian style because we are introducing an American comic book to Chinese, Asian people who may not be familiar with the way American comic books are handled.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, because manga, anime is more dominant in that culture. So I want to find somebody whose style that can probably fit that. And there was consideration getting something very manga-like.
Yeah.
But what I ended up was, when I found Jim Lai, he was a Hong Kong artist. I go, okay, Hong Kong artist is great because they do really great action. They can draw really, powerful-looking physiques and muscles.
Yes.
But at the same time, Hong Kong is one of the most successful comic book genre out there in Asia. So I figured that would be a way to already kind of have a built-in audience. I wouldn't say audience, but a pre-existing visual that they can understand over there.
Right, you can sort of just immediately attach yourself to it.
For people who likes that kind of stuff.
Right.
So that was kind of what I ended up with.
Sure. It's interesting to think about how differently we would receive a show or a comic book if it was drawn in a different style.
Yes.
For example, let's say My Hero Academia was drawn in a different style, like Chibi or something.
Yes.
We would receive it very differently.
Oh, yes.
Even if the rest of the story was functionally the same.
Yeah,
the
that's
way
right.
in which you tell the story is largely defined by the frame that you put it in. And so I think all of that's definitely important. So inking is a major part of the process, right?
Yes and no. In American comic book, there was a sort of a tradition to have inker come in and embellish a penciler. But in Japanese manga, not so much.
Sure.
Mainly because sometimes the artist just pencils and draws the whole book himself. But there are times I can easily tell that a Japanese artist inked over by different people too. Because sometimes they run behind. They need to bring help in and all that kind of stuff too.
Sure, makes sense.
Yeah.
Coloring, that's optional depending on what medium you're thinking.
Depending on what you want to do, you can if you can be a very 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 skilled artist, you can draw a black and white book without having colors at all and be just as powerful as one that is a color book. Coloring, I generally prefer color comic books, because I kind of worked in the American industry for a long time, and it's sort of just part of what it needs to look like.
Right. And then even too, if you intended for it to be black and white, the way in which you design your characters, I think, will be functionally different than if they were in color. So I think that's definitely something to consider. If you look at manga, for example, a lot of the art there isn't colored in. But it still does have the same sort of gravitational pull.
Yes.
Because the design elements, I think, are a little bit different.
Well, the limitations are there when you're doing black and white book.
Yes.
So that's why when you look at manga, sometimes they really have far more detailed rendering of textures and all that kind of stuff because they're trying to get that across without colors.
Yes.
So it's interesting, what we talk about, the kind of medium, the kind of audience, the type of choice you make determines the kind of book you produce.
Absolutely. And all of that comes with time. Obviously, it's not going to be perfect at the beginning, but being willing to really take the time to try to work smarter instead of harder and sort of figure all of that out is incredibly important and useful. So, it's an exciting medium, I think, to be able to delve into. So, what about the editing process?
Well, editing process is an interesting process, because I worked at Marvel Comics before. And editorial is very, 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 very professionally run there at the time. Editing, it's almost kind of you have to determine where the whole direction your comic book is going. Right. That's very, very important. A lot of people don't realize that. You also it's almost having a second set of eyes come in and look at what you got and say, okay, is this where you want to go with the whole project?
Right. So what kind of things do you have to worry about when you're editing?
Number one, to make sure, like we said earlier, if you have a target demographic, that's editorial guidance saying this is where we're going with that.
Right.
Also, maintain the quality of the art. Editors have the ability to say, okay, this panel looks a little off. It doesn't get the story across, or it looks like you're getting lazy in that panel. You want to hack it out. But that's very important because you're missing the elements that can get messages to the readers.
Sure.
So a good editor spots stuff like that. And then editor also at the very end is doing all the proofreading, trying to catch all the misspelled words, stuff that were kind of mistakes done in art or coloring.
Right.
And then make sure the overall quality of the book is good enough, before we put it out.
Sure. One thing that I remember you talking about when it comes to lettering specifically is that you try to make sure that the words are big enough to be read both on mobile and in print, right?
Yes, that's specifically for what we're doing right now. Because how it looks on a printed medium and how it looks on a digital is drastically different.
Exactly.
The fonts can go much, much smaller on print medium, but on digital, sometimes it gets lost. Especially nowadays, a lot of people read their books on a cell phone.
Right.
And you want to be very, very careful with that. What we do in Excel Comics is always make sure the font sizes are generally bigger when compared to most printed books.
It makes sense. And I think, too, that's an important editorial decision to make.
Sure. Yeah, that's another editorial decision.
All of those little things come to trying to make a better product. Sure, the art's great, but if you can't read the text...
Yeah, that's horrible to people, too.
It can get very frustrating.
Yes.
And so I can remember plenty of times when that's happened to me. And I think that's one of the small editorial changes that need to be made when you're trying to port old comic books into that new format. All of it's important. So it all goes together. So far we've talked a bit about the writing process and just the general pre-production process. We've also talked about drawing, and we've talked about coloring, lettering, inking. But one of the things that we really haven't touched on is just how we're going to deliver the comic. What are the different ways in which we can do that?
Well, delivering comic books nowadays, I think it's there's so many ways now. You can still go the traditional route, which is print the books. In America, solicit with Diamond Distribution, and go that way. But now, or even go through, typical newsstands, like book channels and stuff like that.
Right.
But as individual creators, you can easily use the internet for distribution.
Sure.
You can promote yourself on social media. You can talk more in depth about what you're working on, get people really aboard. As opposed to back then, when we were growing up as kids, we see a book on newsstand we buy, we don't know the behind the scenes story. We don't see the hard work and the stuff involved that make us really appreciate what goes into it. But because of social media now, you can get all that information out to the people.
Makes sense.
And give you an extra edge when you want to promote your book.
It's a pretty great time to be able to be publishing comic books. Despite all the adversity, I think there's a lot of opportunity out there. And that's a lot of what we're doing even now.
Yes.
Brushpix is the publisher. Sorry, let's redo that one. Okay. Brushpix is the platform, and Excel Comics is the publisher.
Yes.
Right? One of the great things about our website is that we do take other people's comics to the site, and as long as they've gone through those other steps, I think it's a pretty great opportunity for other people to do the same sort of thing we're doing. Yeah,
we love to have different type of books come in and be presented on our platform. We want to see creators, show off their creativity and talent, and what they're passionate about. It's a start for us right now. Where we definitely hope to achieve to get a lot of people involved and be sort of a team effort all across the board.
Absolutely.
Because in a sense, I feel like what we're creating now is closer to a social media platform for comic book artists.
Sure.
I think that's really needed. We have social media platform for musicians, people who love to do video like YouTube, blog function, people who love to write.
Right.
But yet, when it comes to comic book, it's kind of all out there, and nobody's really making I think, a stronger effort to try to bring it all together.
Makes sense. And I think that we have all the tools needed to do that. But, with hard work, determination, and the help of other people, we can absolutely do
Sure.
it. So those are the steps that go into making a comic book. We think that it's important, and we really appreciate you guys for watching. If you get the opportunity, please definitely click the like button. Go ahead and subscribe to us and make sure to hit the bell. We appreciate you watching the video again. Thanks.
Yeah, see you guys next time.
All right, bye, guys.